Scarcely had the soil settled over Amos Vail's grave when his 31-year legacy was split apart. That division happened at a kitchen table beneath a washed-out Kansas sky in the autumn of 1887. The estate was settled quickly and with harsh simplicity. Caleb Vail, the elder brother, took possession of all that held worth. He inherited the farmhouse, the livestock, the harvested grain, the deep water well, and every tillable field on the property. At the table sat Peter Vail, his wife Elena, their son Samuel, age 6, and a brown dog leaning against the child's leg. Once the reading concluded, Peter's full lot was a worn-out mule, a decaying wagon, and a sterile patch of ground north of the draw. His cash portion came to precisely $15. Caleb slid the sparse coins toward him, a faint sneer curling on his lips. It was an act of pity toward someone destined to fail. Samuel raised his eyes to Elena and asked, "Is Uncle Caleb taking Grandpa's house?" Elena remained silent. Peter raised no protest, no voice, and made no plea for equity. He merely scooped the meager coins into his pocket. From the counter, he took his father's worn-out ledger and rose. He avoided his brother's gaze, turned past the inviting fireplace, and fixed his eyes on the window. He stared out toward the barren northern horizon, where autumn's wind was already gaining force. Their lot consisted of $15 and a wasteland, with winter a scant 2 months off. At dawn the following day, his family departed the only home they'd ever known. The terrain past Cedar Draw appeared hardly fit to sustain rabbits, let alone a family. The ground was dominated by dry gravel, with occasional clumps of sagebrush clinging to the hillsides. Only a handful of gnarled weeds flourished where hardier vegetation had perished. The site held no cabin, no stable, no reliable water source. Even the breeze appeared eager to move on. The worn-out mule strained against the wagon as it crossed ground hardened by countless scorching summers. Every stride seemed arduous. On a gentle hilltop, the family could still spy the Vail homestead far off. Sunbeams glinted off the creek, and the barn's roof held its shape. From the main house, smoke curled out of the chimney, while the grain shed remained full and sturdy. All the wealth Amos Vail had accumulated over decades now rested in Caleb's hands. Peter descended from the wagon and paced a full circle around his own parcel. He glanced from the soil upward, to the horizon, and down again. Underneath, a loose axle creaked. The wagon's sideboard bore a lengthy split, and the canvas top had 3 gashes wide enough for rain. $15 sat in his pocket. Meanwhile, Samuel surveyed the barren landscape. "Will we return there?" Peter traced his son's stare to the far-off house, then lowered his eyes to the ground underfoot. "No," he answered in a soft voice. "We start building here." Yet a difficulty surfaced before Peter Vail hammered a single nail. The closest settlement was miles off. Come midday, Peter stood in Hiram Bell's general store as the proprietor tallied costs with a pencil point. Lumber, nails, tar paper, stovepipe, the total kept rising. A modest cabin suited for 3 people would run above $130. With only $15 to his name, Peter watched Hiram examine the list and push it across the counter. There was little to discuss, for the numbers had settled the matter. Returning to Cedar Draw, another scheme collapsed just as fast, though a thin band of greener grass hinted at water just below. Almost a full day Peter spent excavating gravel and dry dirt, and the cavity deepened. But then a sidewall caved in, filling half the trench. His next approach relied on sod. A sunken area by the draw initially looked hopeful. The initial slice lifted easily, but the second was disturbingly unstable. Obviously, the parched roots were failing to bind the soil. Firewood provided scant relief. Elena collected dried buffalo droppings, while Samuel hauled twigs as slender as fingers. Close by, Bram trotted back triumphantly with a gnarled root about the length of his body. Bram appeared proud of his find, yet there was little cause for anyone else to share his pride. Peter picked up the finest sod brick he had managed to shape and rotated it in his palms. A single fissure gave way to the next, until the whole thing broke apart and dropped at his feet. For a few seconds Samuel observed in silence, with nothing but the breeze crossing the barren soil. Days afterward, a different person came to the claim. Silas Pruitt, a carpenter from nearby who had built homes in 3 counties, pulled his horse to a stop next to the wagon. Without a word, he took a few minutes to look the place over. His gaze traveled from the damaged axle to the worn-out mule, then to Elena, then to Samuel. At last, he studied the bare plot where a home ought to stand. Silas wasn't someone who cracked a joke before sizing up a difficulty. "For a family cabin, you need solid walls," he finally said. "Framing studs, tar paper, a slanted enough roof for snow to slide off, and well-sealed chinks anything short of that, and a Kansas winter will locate every gap." Peter paid attention. The carpenter went on. A properly built 12 by 16 framed cabin would be sufficient. The price seemed fair enough, but the expense was another matter. When Peter told him how little money was left, Silas took off his hat and massaged his neck. No simple answer came to mind. "Sell the property," he advised. "Caleb would end up purchasing it. You'd labor through the winter and begin again in spring." The idea lingered in the silence. Bram moved next to Samuel, using himself to shield part of the breeze. Silas saw how his attention kept returning to the child. When cold seeps in, a child won't think about pride. That statement stung more than an insult. A moment later, he said something more painful still. "You can be certain you're correct, yet still find your son gone by dawn." Peter's face showed no reaction. But even after the carpenter had ridden off, those words lingered. On his next journey, Peter Vail returned to the spot that used to be his home. Fields were bathed in autumn sunshine. Livestock roamed the meadow by the stream. Wagons were parked next to the barn. From afar, the farm appeared no different than it had a month before. The only difference was who owned it. Peter made his way across the yard and halted by the grain shed. "I'm looking to purchase some straw," he said, "or maybe hay." Caleb glanced at the $15 in his brother's palm and laughed softly. "That straw belongs to me." He gestured broadly toward the land. "The cattle are also mine. Everything in sight belongs to me as well." Several hired workers nearby were fixing a fence. Their hammering lost its pace. No one said anything. "If you're thinking about chasing one of those dreams again, stop wasting time gazing at the breeze as if it's in debt to you." Caleb kept talking, and some of the workers turned their heads. The older brother moved nearer. "Father wasted years fixing the messes from your schemes. He went too easy on you." Those words lingered. Then Caleb shoved a heap of aged straw bales with his foot. They were stored behind the barn, many rotted from dampness and already crumbling. He gestured at them. "That's your share more appropriate for a beggar than for decent animal feed." Standing by the wagon, Samuel took in the whole scene. Elena refused to look away from the distant line. Bram gave a quiet warning growl as Caleb approached. Peter didn't reply. He just stooped and collected the thrown-away straw. "Go ahead and build with that, if you're still set on playing make-believe," Caleb shouted at his back. One bale after the next. When Peter had put the final one in the wagon, the jeering had died down. The straw barely had any weight. But as he set it alongside his father's ledger, it seemed oddly significant. Nightfall arrived over Cedar Draw, well before Peter Vail even considered sleeping. Since there were no walls for shelter, the family crowded together each night inside the damaged wagon. A lamp sat burning on a nearby crate, while the old ledger lay open on his lap. Every page bore the script of Amos Vail rainfall records, winter temperatures, livestock notes, and fuel use in tough times. These were data collected through decades of studying the plains. A particular line kept showing up. "The wind takes whatever it can reach." Peter read that again, then glanced at the heap of ruined straw. The bales Caleb had discarded beside the wagon looked silvery in the moonlight. They kept nagging at his thoughts. A childhood recollection appeared. Cold winter evenings in the hayloft, snow falling outside, frost coating the glass. But buried within the stacked straw, the chill somehow felt more distant. He went over and broke a stalk open. The stem split right apart, revealing an empty core. Another was just the same, and yet another contained small pockets, little compartments filled with air. Peter turned the stem back and forth in his hand. Compared to bare boards, a straw mattress offered more warmth to a sleeping body, and a loft filled with straw remained cozy well past dusk. The idea crept gradually into his consciousness, not as excitement or certainty, but as a quieter sense of possibility. On the other side of the wagon, Bram dozed next to Samuel, their calm breathing visible in the chilly darkness. Under a blanket, Elena shifted, catching sight of the still-lit lantern. "Are you thinking about walls?" she inquired. Peter kept his gaze on the straw he held, never raising his eyes from the hollow stem. "What I'm thinking about is what cold can't take away." When morning came, there was no miracle awaiting Peter Vail. The straw remained beside the wagon, and the ground stayed just as desolate. The night hadn't pushed winter any further off. Still, a shift had taken place. Once breakfast was done, Peter lowered himself onto a stretch of bare earth and traced lines in the dust using a stick. Elena observed from close by as Samuel took a seat next to Bram. A footprint of 14 by 18 feet could fit a bed, a stove, and a compact table. It allowed room for a growing child and for a dog clearly resolved to protect him. Peter drew heavier lines along the outer walls. When Elena questioned him, he simply nodded. Thick ones, the design expanded as he spoke. Bales of straw lay flat rather than standing on end. The joints were offset so that seams didn't align. Cedar stakes, split by hand, were pounded through several layers. The corners were reinforced with strips of rawhide. A blend of clay, sand, cut buffalo grass, and ash was applied to the exterior as a protective coating. Even to him, the sketch appeared odd, bearing no resemblance to the cabins found throughout western Kansas. Elena examined the crude plan closely. Above everything else, a single question carried the most weight. Will it hold up? Peter turned his gaze to the wagon, then to the cracked sod bricks scattered nearby. At last, his eyes settled on the $15 left from his inheritance. "I don't know." The reply arrived instantly. "At least you're truthful," he said with a slight smile. "The wagon isn't enough to keep us alive. The sod can't hold together either. Wood would cost more than our money allows." His gaze moved back to the leftover straw. Perhaps it's nothing more than refuse. Even so, it's the one resource we have in abundance. A quiet pause was broken by wind rustling the sagebrush. Samuel gestured at the drawing. "Is Bram allowed to sleep in there as well?" That brought out Peter's first real smile in days. He might be the initial one to see whether it works. Bram raised his head, as though he'd been part of a significant discussion. Elena's gaze traveled from the straw to Samuel, and then to Peter. Without much fuss, the choice was made among them. "Show me where to begin." The labor started first thing the following morning. Peter Vail, a portion of the straw came from the bundles Caleb had discarded. Additional bales were acquired from small ranches with forgotten piles sitting behind outbuildings. In trade for his work, several landowners let him transport the bales away. He gave one afternoon to mending a fence, another to clearing brush along a creek bed. Each bale counted, and each cedar branch mattered as well. Peter turned the branches into stakes and split them with his own hands. At the same time, Elena cut rawhide into thin bands and prepared clay near the draw. Samuel gathered dry grass and stacked it close to the worksite. Bram did his part in his own manner. Time and again, the dog trotted home triumphantly, carrying bits of rope, pieces of fabric, or branches that no one recalled discarding. The unusual undertaking drew notice, and word spread rapidly through western Kansas. Peter Vail was constructing a cabin from straw. Reactions followed almost immediately. Laughter from some, head shaking from others. One rancher predicted the walls would end up as cattle feed, and before winter set in, another person warned that the first strong gust would blow the entire structure across the plains. Caleb appeared especially delighted by the tale, dubbing it Beggars Barn. By the close of the week, the nickname had circulated, and townsfolk were using it regularly. Hiram Bell provided Peter with a few ripped pieces of tar-coated canvas on loan, noting the cost in his ledger. Although the shopkeeper never directly ridiculed the plan, his face conveyed the kind of certainty a banker displays when observing a sinking investment. The walls went up steadily, layer after layer, with the straw laid flat. The seams were offset, and the cedar stakes sank far into the increasing height of the structure. Several weeks afterward, Silas Pruitt came by on horseback to inspect the construction on his own initiative, without seeking approval. He walked up to the unfinished wall, pressed both palms against it, and shoving with force, found that the straw didn't budge. Silas's brow furrowed as he pushed against the wall once more, but it stayed stubbornly still. A long silence hung in the air until he finally stepped back, brushing dust from his palms. That was as near to a compliment as Peter had yet received, though it wasn't really one. Gazing toward the northern horizon, Silas said, "Standing here in September isn't the same as standing here in February." He then climbed onto his horse and departed. For a while, the cabin seemed to prove Peter Vail's confidence well placed. Each week the walls rose higher, the straw stayed dry, and the building looked more robust. Then autumn delivered a reminder. An idea can work beautifully on paper and still fail when tested in the real world. A cold rain swept over Cedar Draw one late afternoon, yet the storm itself caused nothing dramatic. The true damage showed up the next morning. Stepping outside, Peter immediately saw fine cracks running through a broad patch of plaster. Some were no thicker than a fingernail, while others stretched several inches across. By the northern corner, the clay had peeled back enough to reveal the straw beneath. That was bad enough, but what followed was even worse. Damp, dark marks stained the wall's lower edge where rainwater had gathered near the foundation. Peter knelt beside it, noticing that water had remained in a spot where it absolutely shouldn't have. A sharp bark cut into his thoughts. Bram was beside the cabin's north side, clawing at the ground with fierce energy. The dog scratched at the base of the wall and gave another bark. When Peter pulled away a loose scrap of material, he discovered tiny gnaw marks running through several exposed straw strands. Mice. All at once, the whole problem seemed much bigger. If moisture penetrated the walls, the straw could decay. If rodents moved in, the cabin might become a nest rather than a refuge. Silas Pruitt's warning echoed more loudly than ever, but Peter didn't spend the day trying to justify the design. Instead, he spent it making changes. A shallow gravel trench now ringed the cabin to steer water away, and stones from the draw formed a low protective barrier along the bottom. The plaster got a new recipe too: more sand, more wood ash. Extra chopped buffalo grass was added for a stronger bond, while rawhide strips filled in gaps near the sill as Peter worked outside. Elena arranged a trade with Nora Pruitt, Silas Pruitt's wife. By mending a winter coat for Nora's small granddaughter, she obtained a sack of wood ash and several strips of old rawhide. There was no favor involved, just an honest exchange, and that evening Elena set the sack beside Peter. Nora refused all thanks, saying a secure coat seam counts for more than pity. Peter looked from the ash to the wall and then went back to work. The cabin was no longer simply an idea, it had become a lesson, and lessons rarely come without a cost. Those repairs fixed one problem, but did nothing to resolve another. Materials for building still cost money, firewood still demanded payment, and even flour and salt required cash that Peter Vail simply didn't have. A few days later, he guided the wagon into town and halted outside Hiram Bell's store. The list was a small one: a handful of nails, a bag of flour, some salt, and an old stovepipe, its rust indicating many past owners. Hiram gathered everything and opened his account book. The sum owed was modest enough to make it sting. More small debts had a tendency to swell silently. The storekeeper traced his finger down the page, paused, then looked up, and Caleb made an offer. Peter could already see where the conversation was going. $40 for your land hung in the air between them. Enough to pay off the account, enough to rent a room through winter, and enough to keep Samuel warm until spring. Hiram clasped his hands and said, without any cruelty, only a merchant's calculation, you could work for your brother and make a fresh start afterward. To most, the choice would have been simple. Losing land could be recovered from, but surviving a hard winter was far riskier. Peter listened, then shook his head. His answer was plain: no. With a sigh, Hiram added another entry to the ledger, the scratch of ink audible on the page. A few men gathered beside the stove exchanged, knowing glances as Peter reached the door. Hiram called after him, February changes a man's mind. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried grit down the street. Peter tucked the old stovepipe under one arm and made his way toward the wagon. A voice floated from behind him. That pipe will heat the sky before it heats straw walls. He heard laughter, but kept walking. The stovepipe rattled softly against the wagon's side as he climbed aboard and started home. By the time October arrived, Peter Vail realized how much the claim had transformed. What had first been only a sketch scratched into the dirt now stood above the prairie as a true structure. The walls were at full height, with cottonwood poles laid across the top to support the roof. Patches of worn, tarred canvas covered the frame, and a thin sod cap helped lock everything in place. On the exterior, the revised plaster mixture had hardened cleanly. The cracks that had worried Peter earlier showed no signs of returning. Inside, Elena shaped the rough shelter into a space that felt far less like a temporary stopover. A curtain divided the sleeping space, while a little table was positioned along a wall. Samuel took a corner for himself. Bram settled close to the door, where air currents would most likely creep in. As a last touch, Peter hung the cracked thermometer next to the doorway. From that moment, Amos Veal's aged book gained a fresh roll. Each morning and night, the same data was noted: exterior temperature, interior temperature, wind direction, fuel consumed, and the state of the walls. The pages steadily filled with records. During the initial frigid night, the prairie fell to 24 degrees. Before dawn, Peter read the thermometer, showing 39 degrees within the cabin. No fire burned, and no festivities followed. The improvement wasn't huge, but it sufficed for that first occasion. The figures hinted that the walls served a purpose beyond merely holding up the roof. Peter meticulously recorded the outcomes on the page. Elena cast a quick look at the new note, and a slight smile appeared on her lips. "Your father would have appreciated this." Peter glanced at the script. His father's worn volume had taken on a new investigation. A few days afterward, the first major windstorm struck. From the north it descended, moving over Cedar Draw as though it had never been defeated. Ground dust rose into the air. Sagebrush bent under the force. The canvas roof shook, and then Bram jumped up suddenly. Bram gave a bark, then another. Peter picked up the sound a moment later. A detached section of canvas slapped the roof edge. Seizing a roll of rawhide strips, Peter went outside. The cold struck at once. His coat was tugged by the gale. Overhead, the canvas snapped like a whip. Peter mounted the roof's edge, fixed the loose piece in place, and wedged fresh clay into a thin crack by the gable before dusk fell. When he re-entered, his hands were close to frozen. Elena shifted Samuel further away from the doorway, while the little stove consumed buffalo chips and dry sage. The thermometer delivered its judgment. 16 degrees outdoors, 47 degrees indoors. This gap astonished Peter himself. Outside, the gale sounded fierce enough to peel paint off a barn. Inside, it lessened to a faint hum. Below the earlier readings, Peter scribbled a few short notes on the worn pages. North wall held. Roof edge came loose. Was repaired before nightfall. Samuel observed him put down the pen. Did the wind get inside? Peter pressed a palm to the closest wall. The plaster was cool, but the surrounding air wasn't. It wouldn't have mattered out on the prairie, though. The open land kept struggling. Indoors, motionless air started to gain ground. 3 days later, Caleb Vail rode up on horseback. He came with the same intention as usual, to witness the supposedly doomed cabin personally. The low earthen roof brought a sneer. The crooked plaster caused another. He was already muttering the old label as he approached the door. Quite a beggar's barn in here, actually. Then his mockery halted. The air was warmer, not cozy, not notable, just warmer than the open land outside. Caleb took note of it but wouldn't acknowledge it. "A box of straw can deceive a man for a short while," he remarked, scanning the room. "That doesn't make it a house." Peter didn't contest it. The ledger lay open on a nearby shelf. The latest pages were packed with columns of figures, temps, wind headings, fuel consumption, and Caleb leafed through a number of records. Figures won't hold back February. Peter looked over at the wall next to the stove. Maybe no walls would either. The silence stretched on beyond what either of them anticipated. When Caleb asked Samuel if he missed the old house, the boy wouldn't meet his uncle's gaze and said nothing. Bram moved between them, letting out a soft growl. No one mentioned it. Shortly thereafter, Caleb got on his horse and rode back toward the draw. Partway down the hill, he glanced behind him. For the first time, he examined the cabin rather than deriding it. Winter crept closer. One afternoon, Reverend Elias Crow showed up with a little sack of dried apples for Samuel. The quiet pastor spoke softly and selected his phrases deliberately. He explained that families often put up with hard arrangements to sidestep resentment, legal disputes, and permanent rifts. Peter paid attention, then posed a simple query. "Have you actually looked at the deed?" Reverend Crow fell silent. His gaze moved toward the stove. That wordless response was more revealing than anything said aloud, since he had seen it and recognized the truth. The issue wasn't a lack of knowledge, it was leverage. Caleb held property, managed credit, and hired workers across the region. Peter had only a straw house that still hadn't got through a true winter. Talk shifted to other topics. Samuel sat by the wall, snacking on dried apples, with Bram sleeping at his side. Neither one was shivering or appeared conscious of the argument occurring over their heads. A wind blast hit the cabin's north face. The walls took it in, and the minister paused. "I pray it endures." Peter glanced up from the fresh plaster he was working smooth beside the door. "Prayer is appreciated," he replied. "So is plaster." A slight grin crossed Reverend Crow's face. It vanished after that. Prior to departing, he halted next to Amos Vail's ledger book. His palm lay on the binding, and briefly the action seemed almost unintentional. Still, he pulled his hand back fast, as if the aged volume held more than mere pages. Beyond the walls, the wind kept blowing over Cedar Draw. Within, a different sort of stillness lingered. January came bearing a caution, not a final judgment. Early one day, before dawn, Peter Vail examined the thermometer. -8 degrees Fahrenheit outdoors, 53 indoors. He wrote down the details. 1 pan of buffalo chips and sage consumed for fuel, northern wall moisture, free, southern windowsill snug. The notation appeared nearly impossible to believe. On the opposite side of Cedar Draw, residents kept their stoves going non-stop. Air seeped through the old timber walls. Firewood supplies diminished rapidly, and coal drained away fast. Yet inside the straw-covered cabin, the stockpile of fuel was bigger than Elena had anticipated. She observed this ahead of Peter. Everyday existence had shifted in subtle respects, too. Samuel stopped bringing up the previous farmhouse. One night, as he laid out his bedding by the wall, he called the cabin our home. Without a word, Elena bent her head and swirled the stew in the pot. Peter caught the remark but chose not to respond. January had demonstrated a great deal, yet not quite enough on that evening. Bram moved away from the hot stove and planted himself by the door, ears aimed northward. The canine remained attentive for quite a while. The worst stretch of winter was still to come. Whatever had captured Bram's attention in the bitter blackness eventually showed itself. On the 12th of February, 1888, morning broke. Under a sky resembling aged iron, Peter Vail spotted the shift prior to dawn. The lone barometer beside the entrance had been dropping since the middle of the night, gradually at first and then more quickly. By the time breakfast arrived, the indicator had descended enough to wipe away any leftover hopefulness from January. Beyond, the prairie lay in wait. It hit at midday. An Arctic blast smashed into Cedar Draw so violently that flying snow had no opportunity to land. The white masses tore over the terrain horizontally rather than falling straight down. The mercury started plummeting. 21 degrees, then 3, and just a few hours after that, 11 below freezing. The blizzard appeared, resolved to blur the boundary between ground and heavens. Indoors, Peter worked with careful precision. The leather seal, encircling the door, got a final check. Wet clay closed a slim crack close to the roof's peak. Firewood was moved nearer to the heating stove. The chimney pipe received 2 inspections. Every action moved slowly, yet every action was done with meticulous attention. On the far side of the space, Elena warmed water while keeping Samuel bundled in quilts, making sure her words carried no anxiety. Bram lay down next to the doorway, lifting his head every little while to face the northern wall. The structure took the initial strikes, followed by the next, and then the next. Gusts pounded the cabin relentlessly. The The ceiling let out a creak. The canvas stretched and then slackened. Outside, snow hissed across the surface. But a crucial thing failed to occur. The walls didn't tremble as a timber, framed building would. Their heft distributed the pressure around the full structure. The force came on, lingered, and then continued onward. Indoors, the thermometer held its reading. 55 degrees, later 52. Still much warmer than what was needed to live. Peter jotted down every figure, even though his fingers grew numb from the chill. While the blizzard intensified outdoors, the data collection persisted inside. The barometer kept dropping, and the Arctic wind grew harsher. The walls endured yet one more hour, then another. The natural world provided neither explanations nor cautionary hints. It merely added to the heaviness of its sentence. An especially fierce blast battered the dwelling. Around dusk, Samuel raised his eyes from his covering and asked, "Will the wind carry off our house?" For a brief second, Peter turned his attention not to the gale but to the building around him. The walls gave a muted reply. "No," he told them, with his palm placed on the plaster. There's a heaviness now beyond the entrance. The snowstorm pressed on, and the genuine challenge was just starting. After nightfall, the first rapping sound arrived, though it hardly carried to the cabin. Most of the noise was consumed by the gale, and what remained was swept off by the snow. Still, Bram caught it. The dog leapt up, dashed to the door, and let out barks powerful enough to penetrate the blizzard. Peter unfastened the latch, and a surge of icy wind rushed in. On the other side of the entrance were Silas Pruitt, Nora, and their little granddaughter, all bundled in frost-hardened blankets. Their coats bore a layer of snow, and ice clung to their lashes and brows. The carpenter's own home had survived, but that had ceased to matter. Drafts had been leaking between the framing timbers. The fire in the stove was kept blazing hour after hour, yet the cold continued to creep in. Peter moved out of the way, and no one spent a moment on vain dignity. About 60 minutes later, Bram barked once more, and the shape beyond the door was recognizable this time. Caleb Vail, waiting in the dark. The confident stance had vanished. The relaxed smile was nowhere to be seen. His shoulders were dusted with snow. The cold had left a bluish tinge on his lips. His wife and 2 children were standing behind him. Part of the grain shed was buried under snow after a storage roof gave way. Even worse, the farmhouse couldn't be kept warm. A bucket sitting inside had ice forming around its rim. Caleb sent his family ahead. Then he halted, with one boot still outside the doorframe. He seemed unsure for the first time in months, as though his place there was no longer clear. He attempted to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Without hesitation, Peter seized the front of his brother's coat and yanked him inside. The door closed, and the storm was swallowed by the darkness once more. Every bit of space was now vital, and fuel had to be measured differently right away. Extra people meant extra warmth, but they also required more. Wet coats were kept off the walls, and the stove was constantly tended. The door was opened only in case of absolute necessity. They all sat huddled near one another. As time dragged on, the wind kept battering the cabin. Another issue started to surface. Samuel started coughing, not nonstop, but often enough for Elena to look over at Peter. The stack of fuel appeared diminished compared to the morning. Nonetheless, no one brought up leaving, said the nickname, or recalled the laughter in town. Those walls, previously mocked as a beggar's barn, were now sheltering everyone within, and the snowstorm was nowhere near over. At last, the storm relented. On the third morning, sunshine was the first sign, followed by stillness after almost 3 full days of howling wind. The silence was so complete it felt strange. Peter Vail pushed the door open and went outside. The landscape had vanished under snow. The drifts came up to the windowsills. Fences were invisible, and even well-known landmarks were unrecognizable. The thermometer gave its final verdict, 32 below. The cabin's interior remained at 49 degrees. No one would have described it as cozy, but comfort wasn't the point. Everyone was still breathing. That was all that mattered. Samuel's cough had subsided. Bram stretched out by the stove and yawned, acting as though the prior 72 hours had been only a minor annoyance. The visitors made ready to depart one by one. Silas Pruitt paused by the wall before getting on his horse, pressing his hand against the plaster for a few seconds. The carpenter, who had previously insisted on studs, tar paper, and ordinary walls, was now examining the building with a look of surprise. "What ratio of ash did you add to the plaster?" That was his first technical question. Peter responded, and more questions came one after another. Not far away, Nora and Elena looked at each other. They barely spoke, for words weren't necessary. Certain lessons speak for themselves. The roads gradually reopened during the next days, and Reverend Elias Crow finally reached the homestead. The minister discovered Caleb outside the cabin gazing at the walls and remained quiet. For a lengthy pause, Caleb also said nothing. They both just looked at the building that shouldn't have stood, or so every critic had claimed. At last Caleb spoke. "Dad would have figured this out." Peter lingered at the door while a chilly wind swept over the snow. All he did was jot down a few notes. There were no apologies and no emotional reconciliation. Nature had already resolved the dispute. Several weeks later, spring came. The cabin still stood, and people still had questions. Neighbors started to ask about drainage ditches, while others were curious about the plaster mixes. Some wanted assistance putting up sheds, then poultry houses, then storm shelters. Peter didn't keep any of it hidden and demonstrated the gravel trench to them. What counted was the stone skirting, the cedar posts, and the plaster. Above all, he stressed the importance of trapped air. That nickname stuck around longer than anticipated, and folks still referred to it as Beggars Barn. But now no one joked when using that name. Late one night, with the cabin silent and the final guest gone, Peter leafed through Amos Vail's book. It was the last time he would do so that winter. Near the bottom of the page sat the last entry from the blizzard. February 14. His gaze settled on North Wind House and lingered momentarily. He shut the book, not as someone savoring a triumph, but as a son. At last he had completed something that his father had begun long ago,